sides of Miss Flora's spacious lawn lived many flowers. There were 3 types of roses near the back of the house and lower part of the driveway. Zinnias of the orange, salmon and red variety stood neatly among their other vibrant companions. Yellow and purple chrysanthemums smiled brightly by the property's gate. Bluebells swung their brilliant violet shapes in the passing breeze. Purple-hearted glorias sat happily by the front porch, while red poppies maintained their residence by the back porch, and delicate daisies, pink and red, formed the boundary of every other flower. A group of plain green daylilies stood close to the backyard by the property's border, which had been outlined with aging red brick. They were the plainest flowers in the yard. Miss Flora had thought so. A particular daylily had heard her remark on them quite negatively and had never forgotten it since. Miss Flora was right after all. The daylily thought day after day. It and its siblings were all as green as the leafless stalks on which they stood. The daylilies were all so boring-looking that they seemed to merge with the uninteresting blades of grass around them. The daylilies' lack of interesting features caused them to receive the least amount of attention from all the other flowers, and the particular daylily had noticed how whenever the wind excited all the garden's flowers and they gossiped, they would talk about how brilliantly red the zinnias looked and what must have caused them to blush so. Many flowers always watched the bluebells slyly, wondering why the bees kept disappearing in them for long stretches of time, as if they were conducting secret meetings inside. Sometimes the flowers marveled at the soft beauty of the chrysanthemums and openly envied their colors. Never did they envy the daylilies, because there was nothing to envy. There was nothing to look at, nothing to admire. All year the garden flowers spoke of the annual spring ball. Everyone would attend to showcase their lovely gowns, and all animals with wings and without would be the fascinated spectators. Whatever they saw would be spoken of in other gardens, maybe even in places across the big blue water for a long time afterwards, even into the dying months. Many flowers trembled and shook their petals excitedly at the idea. Always they mentioned the beauty they expected to see on full display from all the garden's flowers, except for that of the daylilies. No one ever cared to anticipate the performance of the bland green flowers. It never seemed as if daylilies were ever remembered in such conversations at all, and the daylily morosely thought that there would never come the day when there was ever anything remarkable about them to mention. One day a flower bud popped its head through the soil, just on the border between the daylilies and the pink daisies. It had been imperceptible beneath the blades of grass at first, but as it grew it took on colour. The other flowers noticed it and saw that it couldn't be identified as belonging to any of them. It was a flower that Miss Flora herself hadn't planted. Everyone was sure of that. Some birds suggested that one of their brethren must have unknowingly transported its seed to Miss Flora's garden while flying overhead one day, and the seed had quietly germinated and taken root. The growing bud was the talk of the garden for a very long time. All the flowers marveled at it, since they didn't know what it was and could only guess. What flower was it whose green bud was stained with such lovely purple and pink streaks, or were those streaks a sharp blue and soft red? It grew larger and larger, taller and taller. It definitely hadn't been invited by Miss Flora to live in the garden among the others. There came the day when the strange bud's green shell popped open and colourful petals emerged for the very first time. Most of the petals were a fiery orange and struck the air as tips of a spear. 2 other bladed petals were a stark purple, and another of its petals was a lovely red. The young flower yawned and gracefully leaned its head back so that it could fully enjoy the sunlight. The flowers around it gazed in admiration. It was beautiful. Birds who came to see it thought it quite resembled their cousins from the south, whose feathers carried similar colours. The daylily was fascinated by the flower's beauty. There seemed to be colours everywhere on its body. It was also such a charming, polite flower that everyone fell over themselves to be in constant conversation with it. They wanted to know where the flower came from, which it didn't know, of course, and it felt so out of place among the other flowers that the entire garden felt sorry for it. The mysterious flower knew its beauty because the entire garden openly admired it, but it remained modest and kind to everyone. This only made all the flowers love it more. Ms. Flora was the last to discover it, and when she did, she caused quite a commotion. Oh my!" she exclaimed one morning. "A bird of paradise! In my garden? Who put you here?" She looked at it for a time, awestruck, before shouting over the brick wall, "Mrs. Brown, have you seen this? I've got a bird of paradise in my yard." While Mrs. Brown and Miss Flora gathered and generated a small cyclone between them over the solitary flower, the sad daylily grew sadder still. Never had Miss Flora found the daylilies beautiful, and she never would. Days after discovering the presence of the bird of paradise, Miss Flora burst out of her front door with large items under her arms. She headed for the side of the house and set the items down rather unceremoniously on a few indignant flowers and several offended blades of grass. She straightened the old blouse that she wore and cocked her beret before setting up an easel, a canvas, and 2 stools. One stool was for her to sit on, the other was for her set of paints, paintbrushes, and a jar of clean water. Miss Flora was inspired, and the new flower was the source of it. She had already taken pictures of it, but wanted to immortalize it in a more classical way. Miss Flora seated herself, and her shadow was cast over the sad daylily. It watched the woman prepare her paints while praising the bird of paradise. She would do it justice, she promised the flower, no matter how many days it took to get its perfect likeness on paper. She began her attempt, which lasted for some time. So enthusiastic was she that she caused a bit of paint to splash on the grass, even touching the stems of some of the flowers. At a moment unexpected, the sad daylily was almost bowled over when a drop of blue paint struck it in the head. While the daylily straightened miserably, it found that the other flowers within view were looking at it. They had never noticed it before. Now not only were they looking at the daylily, they were whispering about it too. "The daylily's wearing a lovely shade of blue," some of them said in a mixture of admiration and puzzlement. "But daylilies don't wear blue clothes, do they?" "Not from what I remember," the other flowers replied. "Daylilies have always been green." "It's paint," said some flowers. "Miss Flora's paint stained it blue." "That's not unfortunate at all. How beautiful." Beautiful. They thought that the blue paint that now stained half of the sad daylily's head had made it beautiful, and the longer it listened to them, the more flattering words it discovered. They called it exquisite, stunning, eye-catching even. Even the bird of paradise, who had never spoken to it before or acknowledged its presence, did so then. "What breathtaking petals you have!" it exclaimed softly. As the day went on, it seemed that the sad daylily's newfound beauty was never short on praise. Zinnias, daisies, roses, and chrysanthemums spoke of it and desired to hear new gossip about it. That night, as the paint hardened on its petals in the cold night air, the daylily could barely sleep. The day had all been so surreal. The next morning, the daylily woke up later than usual. Its blurred eyesight darkened as Miss Flora walked over it, wearing the same clothes as the day before. She set her stools on the ground in the same position and placed her paints and bottle of water in their previous places. Miss Flora, determined to create the perfect painting of her bird of paradise, started anew on a blank canvas. As the daylily yawned and straightened its petals, it listened to the scrape and slap of paintbrushes against paper. It also heard the continued gossip about it, as well as praise for its blue petals travelling on the back of the passing wind. A gob of paint suddenly shot away from Miss Flora's paintbrush as she worked. It hit the daylily's head, knocking it back. But when the flower's dizziness ebbed, it realized that the garden was once more focused on it. They whispered among themselves while gazing at it. It also realized that several more of its petals had been coated with a new color. This time they had been smeared with a bright yellow. "Yellow, green and blue petals," Flowers exclaimed. "What a rare combination." "Lovely," others said. "Such a unique daylily." Flowers watched its every movement, and the daylily blushed uncontrollably. It was once more the center of attention. Now the whole garden wanted to know its opinions on everything, from the growing heat that had found them in the middle of spring to the influx of bee colonies that had invaded Miss Flora's backyard. They wanted to hear its opinions about everything, because the colorful daylily's thoughts were now important. By nightfall it was exhausted. It had spoken so much to so many flowers about topics ranging from the interesting to the mundane. It was as if the daylily had planted itself into a new world where all of its thoughts were valued. It went to sleep early because it was more weary than the night before. Its movements were wooden because some of its petals had stiffened and stung from soreness whenever the daylily tried to move them. It would rest, it told itself, and it would feel better tomorrow. The next morning, the daylily woke long after dawn had risen. For several seconds, it didn't know where it was, but as understanding returned, it saw that Miss Flora had come back to her now customary spot to try painting the bird of paradise again. As Miss Flora spoke to herself, words of encouragement, and praised the beauty of the bird of paradise, the daylily swooned slightly. Parts of its body burned and throbbed in pain, but its spirits were lifted by the kind words of the flowers around it that continued to admire it. They did their best to include the daylily in every bit of conversation. Every now and then, Miss Flora retreated to the house to rest or do a bit of housework before returning again to resume painting. It was nearly late afternoon when, on returning to her stool, she espied the painted daylily. She tilted her head in amusement at the colours that stained it, then laughed. "Paint? Some of my paints must have gotten on your dress," she said. "And what an interesting combination, too." On a thought, she reached for one of her brushes. "Here, let's improve things." She dipped the brush in red paint and painted the daylily's other petals. She then used purple paint to coat the flower's leaves and orange to change the colour of its stem. "There! Now you're as colourful as the bird of paradise." Miss Flora turned her attention away from the daylily and focused on completing her work. The garden was in a soft uproar. The daylily was now more beautiful than it had ever been. Never had a flower carried so many hues from stalk to stem. Even the birds had never seen such vibrant colours on anyone else. The flowers repeatedly compared the beauty of the daylily to that of the bird of paradise. Were they not now equal? Was the beauty of the daylily, in fact, more arresting than that of the bird of paradise? While the daylily enjoyed all the flattering words of the garden, it could no longer bear the heat of the sun, which seemed to have magnified itself almost 100-fold. The air was not as clean as it used to be, and it hurt to breathe. But it had been included in so many conversations about the upcoming spring ball, of which it would be an esteemed guest. They hoped the daylily would parade itself at the event, so that they could further marvel at its beauty, which they would compare to that of the chrysanthemums and roses. They would compare it to the beauty of the bird of paradise itself. That night, everything seemed even more unbelievably wonderful and dreamlike than before. The daylily's thoughts swam with the news that flowers were looking forward to its attendance at the ball. It would be the topic of discussion near and far, in places that it had never seen or heard of. Its importance would be impressed upon everyone. But the daylily was ill. Its skin itched in every part and couldn't be soothed no matter how vigorously it scratched. No matter how hard it tried, it struggled to breathe. It could barely speak above murmurs and miserable groans. The daylily's sight waned with every passing second, and its body grew weaker and weaker. It would take great care of itself, the daylily promised. It would make sure that it healed well enough for the ball, where it would be praised more than ever before. It would be the talk of the garden for months to come, even years. That night, the daylily went to sleep. By morning, it was dead. The paint had killed it quietly, and its lifeless leaves, petals, and stem lay forlornly on the grass. The flowers spread the word of its passing. They mourned the death of someone so beautiful, someone whose beauty they had never seen before. Such a shame, they thought, that someone so magnificent had died so soon. Thank you for listening to the story of the daylily. Come back for another story in the Plants series.